Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The surveillance camera blinks red in the darkness, recording everything and nothing all at once. A playground sits empty under flickering streetlights. Courthouse doors swing closed after another sentencing. These images repeat across America, fragments of a pattern most people never see until it's too late. Tonight, we're going to examine that pattern, pull it apart, and ask the question that haunts every community that's lived through tragedy. What happens when warning signs are seen but not acted on? This isn't a story about 5 random crimes. This is a story about 5 preventable tragedies, 5 moments when systems designed to protect people simply didn't work fast enough, or didn't work at all. These cases span different states, different decades, different types of violence. But they share something fundamental. In each one, someone saw something. Someone knew something. And yet, the machinery of prevention, of intervention, of justice, ground too slowly to stop what was coming. We're going to spend the next few hours walking through these cases with the respect they deserve. These aren't entertainment. These are real people whose lives ended or changed forever because the systems we trust failed them. We'll look at surveillance and what it can and cannot prevent. We'll examine parole systems stretched so thin they become meaningless. We'll confront the impossible decisions courts face when children commit adult crimes. We'll see what happens when mental illness collides with a system unprepared to handle it. And we'll witness how trust, that most human of bonds, can become the deadliest weapon of all. The first case changed how America thinks about security cameras. It made us believe that if we just watched closely enough, we could keep our children safe. But as we'll see, watching isn't the same as protecting. And knowing what happened isn't the same as preventing it from happening in the first place. Bayshore Heights was the kind of place people moved to specifically because nothing bad ever happened there. A coastal town in Sunridge County, population just under 15,000, where everyone knew their neighbors and kids still walked home from school alone. The year was 2003, before smartphones, before every parent could track their child's location in real time. Trust was the currency of daily life, and it seemed like a safe investment. Emily Hartwell was 11 years old that summer. She was the kind of kid teachers loved, bright and curious, always raising her hand with questions that showed she'd actually been paying attention. She had a gap between her front teeth that she was self-conscious about, and she loved marine biology even though she'd never seen the ocean up close, just the harbor where fishing boats came and went. Her parents, David and Christine, ran a small bookstore downtown. Emily would help them stock shelves after school, organizing the children's section with a precision that made her mother laugh. On a Thursday evening in late August, Emily left the library at 6:15. She'd been working on a project about dolphins, taking notes in her careful handwriting, the kind where every letter looks almost printed. The library was 4 blocks from her house, a walk she'd made hundreds of times. The route took her down Maple Street, past the hardware store and the coffee shop, then left onto Seabreeze Avenue where the houses started. It was still light out, that golden hour before sunset when everything looks painted. She never made it home. Christine called the library at 6:45 when Emily wasn't back yet. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, remembered her leaving right on time, backpack over both shoulders, waving goodbye at the door. Christine called David at the store. He closed up immediately and drove the route Emily would have taken, scanning sidewalks and yards, that first flutter of real worry starting in his chest. By 7:30, they called the police. The Bayshore Heights Police Department had 3 full-time officers and 2 part-time deputies. Missing child cases were not something they had protocols for, not real ones. Chief Robertson took the call himself, and within an hour, he'd requested assistance from the county sheriff and contacted the FBI field office 2 hours north. Everyone understood, even if no one said it out loud yet, that the first 24 hours were critical. They found the surveillance footage at 10:30 that night. The self-service car wash on the corner of Maple and Seabreeze had installed a camera 6 months earlier after someone had broken into the change machine. It was a basic setup, grainy black and white, recording onto a tape that looped every 72 hours. The owner, Frank Delgado, didn't even think about it until a deputy knocked on his door asking if he had any cameras pointing toward the street. Frank rewound the tape to 6:15 and pressed play. Emily appeared at the edge of the frame at 6:17, walking with that particular gait of a kid who's thinking about something else, maybe the dolphin project, maybe what was for dinner. She paused at the corner, looking both ways like she'd been taught. That's when the vehicle entered the frame. It was a light-colored van, probably white or tan, hard to tell in the black and white footage. It slowed as it approached Emily, then stopped completely just past her. The tape showed Emily turning toward the van. The driver's window was down. There was a conversation, 45 seconds of Emily standing on the sidewalk talking to whoever was inside. Her body language wasn't scared. She stepped closer. Then she moved out of frame, toward the passenger side of the van, and the vehicle pulled away. The entire interaction took less than 2 minutes. Christine Hartwell watched that tape 17 times in the first night. She memorized every movement her daughter made, every small shift in posture. She tried to read Emily's lips, tried to see what would make her walk toward that van. David couldn't watch it more than once. He left the room and stood outside the police station, gulping air, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't light the cigarette someone offered him. The FBI brought in video enhancement specialists from Quantico. They worked frame by frame, sharpening the image, trying to pull a license plate number or a clearer view of the driver. The plate was obscured by dirt or damage, only partial letters visible. The driver was male, that much was clear, baseball cap, possibly facial hair, but facial features were impossible to determine. The van's make and model were identified as a mid-90s Ford Econoline, hundreds of which were registered in the Tri-County area alone. They released the footage to the public on Friday afternoon. By Friday evening, every news station in the state was running it on loop. By Saturday morning, it had gone national. People watched Emily Hartwell walk toward that van over and over again, each viewing another small violence against the memory of who she'd been. Tips flooded in. Hundreds of them. Someone saw a white van parked suspiciously near a school. Someone else remembered a man in a baseball cap at the grocery store acting strangely. Each tip required follow-up, each one pulling already stretched resources in another direction. The FBI coordinated search parties. Volunteers combed the beaches, the woods, abandoned buildings. Divers searched the harbor. Meanwhile, detectives built a profile. The abduction was opportunistic, but not random. The driver had to know the area, know that stretch of road, know it was isolated enough for a brief stop. He'd approached Emily with something that made her comfortable enough to engage, possibly claiming to know her parents, possibly asking for directions, possibly offering something. And he'd done it with confidence, the kind that comes from practice or planning or both. On Sunday afternoon, a detective named Sarah Winters was reviewing registrations of Ford Econoline vans for the third time when something caught her attention. One of the registered owners, Caleb Rourke, age 34, lived alone in a rental house 7 miles outside of town. He worked as an auto technician at a shop that had closed down 2 months earlier. No criminal record, no red flags in the system. But something about the address bothered her. She pulled up a map and realized Rourke's house was on a dead-end road that backed up to state forest land, isolated, rarely patrolled. 2 FBI agents and 3 county deputies approached the house at 4 in the afternoon. The white Ford van was parked in the driveway, visible from the road. When Rourke answered the door, he was calm, almost friendly. Yes, that was his van. No, he hadn't been anywhere near Maple Street on Thursday. He'd been home all day, no alibi, just watching television. Would they like to come in? They would. The house was neat, surprisingly so for a single man living alone. But in the garage, they found Emily's backpack, pushed behind a stack of paint cans, still containing her library books and the notebook about dolphins. They found traces of blood in the van's carpet that would later match Emily's DNA. And in Rourke's bedroom closet, behind a false panel, they found photographs. Dozens of them. Children at parks, at schools, walking home alone. Emily was in 3 of the photos, taken weeks before her abduction, images of her leaving the library, crossing streets, unaware she was being watched. Caleb Rourke was arrested at 4:45 on Sunday afternoon. By 9 that evening, after 6 hours of questioning, he confessed. He told them where to find Emily's body. She was in the state forest, buried in a shallow grave near a hiking trail that hardly anyone used anymore. The recovery team went out Monday morning just after dawn. Christine and David Hartwell were not told the details of what was found, only that their daughter had been located and that she had not survived. The medical examiner would later confirm that Emily had died within hours of her abduction, that she had not suffered long, though that small mercy felt like no mercy at all to parents who would spend the rest of their lives replaying that Thursday evening. The autopsy revealed Emily had been asphyxiated. There was evidence of blunt force trauma to her head, likely from being struck with something heavy, and then she'd been strangled. The medical examiner believed she'd lost consciousness quickly. It was, in the most clinical sense, a relatively quick death. But clinical sense means nothing to a mother who keeps setting a place at the dinner table by mistake, or a father who still listens for his daughter's footsteps on the stairs. Caleb Rourke's confession was cold and methodical. He didn't cry or show remorse in any traditional sense. He explained that he'd been watching Emily for almost a month, learning her routines, noting when she was alone. On Thursday evening, he told her that her mother had sent him to pick her up, that there'd been an emergency at the bookstore. Emily, trusting and taught to respect adults, had believed him. She'd gotten into the van willingly, asking what was wrong, if her parents were okay. Rourke drove her to his house. What happened there was not something he detailed, and the prosecutors didn't push. They had enough for multiple life sentences or the death penalty. The specifics of Emily's final hours would remain mostly private, a small dignity preserved. The community of Bayshore Heights erupted in grief and rage. Vigils were held every night for a week. Emily's school created a memorial scholarship. The bookstore where her parents worked became an impromptu shrine. People leaving flowers and stuffed dolphins and notes addressed to a girl who would never read them. But beneath the grief was a seething anger, questions that demanded answers. How had Rourke been able to watch Emily for weeks without anyone noticing? How had he been able to abduct her in broad daylight on a street where people lived and worked? And most pressing of all, were there warning signs that had been missed? The investigation into Rourke's background revealed a man who'd lived quietly and carefully, presenting a normal face to the world. He paid his rent on time. He kept his lawn mowed. Neighbors described him as polite but private, the kind of person you'd wave to but never really talk to. But there were cracks if you looked closely. He'd been fired from 2 previous jobs for what employers vaguely described as inappropriate behavior. Nothing illegal enough to report, just a sense that something was off. He'd been asked to leave a community center where he'd volunteered because staff felt uncomfortable with how much time he spent watching the children's programs. None of this information had been centralized or shared. None of it had triggered any official investigation. Rourke had existed in the spaces between systems, his behavior questionable, but never quite crossing the line that would bring intervention. Until it did. The trial began 8 months later in April of 2004. Rourke pleaded not guilty, a decision that baffled even his own defense attorney. The evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance footage, the backpack, the photographs, the confession, the DNA evidence, all of it pointed to guilt so absolute that a trial felt almost performative. But Rourke insisted, and so the legal machinery ground forward. The prosecution presented their case over 3 weeks. They showed the surveillance footage in court, and everyone watched Emily walk toward that van again, knowing now what had happened next. They presented the photographs found in Rourke's closet, each one a small horror, proof of predation and planning. They had FBI profilers testify about predatory behavior and grooming patterns. They had the medical examiner explain, in careful technical language, how Emily had died. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity, suggesting Rourke suffered from mental illness that prevented him from understanding his actions. Psychiatrists examined him and found no evidence of psychosis or delusion. Rourke was, by all clinical measures, sane. He understood right from wrong. He'd simply chosen wrong. David and Christine Hartwell attended every day of the trial. They sat in the front row, holding hands, their faces masks of controlled devastation. Christine would later say that sitting through the trial was like dying slowly, each piece of evidence another small cut. David said he went numb after the first week, that he'd leave his body during the hardest testimony and float somewhere near the ceiling, watching himself sit there, wondering how he was still breathing. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They found Caleb Rourke guilty on all counts including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts of stalking related to the photographs of other children. The sentencing phase began immediately. The prosecution sought the death penalty. The defense argued for life in prison, claiming that execution would be cruel and unusual punishment. The judge listened to both sides, reviewed precedents, and then delivered a sentence that surprised no one: death by lethal injection. Caleb Rourke showed no reaction when the sentence was read. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he'd already known. He was transferred to death row at the state penitentiary, where he would spend the next decade filing appeals, each one denied, each one extending the wait, but never changing the outcome. But Emily's case didn't end with Rourke's conviction. It became a catalyst for change, the kind of tragedy that forces a society to look at itself and ask hard questions. Within 6 months of the trial, Sunridge County had installed over 200 new surveillance cameras in public areas. Schools implemented stricter pickup and drop-off protocols. A countywide registry was created for individuals flagged for inappropriate behavior around children, even if no criminal charges had been filed, a controversial system that raised privacy concerns but gained public support in the wake of Emily's death. The state legislature passed what they called Emily's Law, requiring better coordination between law enforcement agencies regarding individuals with patterns of concerning behavior. It mandated background checks for anyone working with or volunteering around children, checks that went beyond criminal records to include employment history and references. It allocated funding for more FBI resources dedicated to child abduction cases in the critical first hours. These changes mattered. They saved lives, though we'll never know exactly how many because prevented tragedies don't make headlines. But they also revealed something uncomfortable. Emily Hartwell had died not because the tools to prevent her death didn't exist, but because those tools hadn't been used effectively. The surveillance camera that captured her abduction had been installed for property protection, not child safety. The warning signs about Rourke's behavior existed in scattered complaints and uneasy feelings, but no system existed to collect and analyze that information. Emily had been failed not by absence, but by neglect, by systems that existed in theory but not in practice. Christine Hartwell became an advocate for child safety legislation, traveling to other states, speaking at conferences, meeting with lawmakers. She channeled her grief into action, believing that if Emily's death had to mean something, it should mean that other children would be protected. David couldn't do the same. He closed the bookstore 2 years after Emily's death and moved away from Bayshore Heights. The town held too many ghosts. He remarried eventually, had another daughter, but he never spoke publicly about Emily. His grief was private, a wound that never fully closed. The surveillance footage of Emily's abduction is still used in law enforcement training. Officers watch it to understand how quickly an abduction can happen, how normal everything looks until it isn't. Child safety advocates use it to teach parents about awareness and communication. But every time it's shown, it raises the same uncomfortable question. If we can watch something terrible happen, frame by frame, but can't stop it, what exactly are we watching for? Emily Hartwell was buried in Bayshore Heights Cemetery on a hill overlooking the harbor she'd loved. Her gravestone is simple, just her name and dates and a carved dolphin. People still leave flowers there, even now, more than 2 decades later. Some of them knew her. Most didn't. But everyone who visits understands what she represents. The child who should have made it home safely and didn't. The failure point in a system that promised protection but delivered only documentation. Caleb Rourke was executed by lethal injection in 2014, 10 years after his conviction. He declined to make a final statement. His death brought no closure to the Hartwells, only an ending, which is not the same thing. Christine was not present for the execution. She'd said everything she needed to say in her victim impact statement at the original sentencing. David didn't attend either. Rourke's death changed nothing for them. Emily was still gone. That would never change. But if Emily's case taught America that surveillance could capture crimes, the next case would teach a harder lesson. That watching someone commit a crime, even multiple crimes over decades, means nothing if the system keeps letting them go free. This failure wasn't about missing evidence or overlooked warning signs. This was about warning signs that were seen, documented, and then ignored over and over again until the body count became undeniable. Victor Halden was born in 1958 in a small town in eastern Montana where winters were brutal and memories were long. His childhood was marked by instability, the kind that gets written about in true crime profiles as if it's an excuse rather than just context. His father drank and disappeared for weeks at a time. His mother worked double shifts at a truck stop diner and had little energy left for parenting. Victor was left to raise himself, mostly, along with the other kids in the trailer park who formed their own loose family of neglect. The first time Victor Halden hurt someone, he was 13 years old. A neighbor's dog had been barking for hours, that kind of relentless sound that gets into your skull. Victor walked over with a baseball bat and beat the animal until it stopped making noise permanently. The neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Thornton, found his dog's body in the yard and called the police. Victor was questioned but claimed he'd been nowhere near the Thornton property. There were no witnesses, no proof beyond the old man's suspicion. The case went nowhere. A year later, Victor was arrested for breaking into a teacher's house and stealing jewelry. He was 14. The juvenile court sentenced him to probation and counseling. The counselor noted in her report that Victor showed limited empathy and seemed to view consequences as things that happened to other people. She recommended continued supervision and possible residential treatment. The recommendation was filed away and forgotten. Victor completed his probation without incident, or at least without getting caught for anything else. At 16, he attacked a classmate behind the school gymnasium, a girl 2 years younger who'd rejected his advances. He didn't rape her, but the assault was violent enough to require hospitalization. The girl's family wanted to press charges. Victor's mother hired a lawyer who argued that Victor had mental health issues stemming from his traumatic childhood. The judge, influenced by Victor's age and the lack of a serious criminal record beyond the earlier burglary, sentenced him to a juvenile detention facility until he turned 18. He served 14 months. The pattern was established. Victor would hurt someone, get caught or nearly caught, receive a sentence that was intended to be rehabilitative, and then be released back into the world with minimal supervision. Each time, the system noted concerns. Each time, those concerns were documented but not acted upon in any meaningful way. Victor was slipping through the cracks, except calling them cracks suggests they were small gaps. These were chasms. He turned 18 in juvenile detention and was released as an adult with a clean record. Juvenile offenses were sealed. To the adult criminal justice system, Victor Halden was starting fresh, a young man with no history, no red flags, no reason for concern. He moved west, working odd jobs, never staying in one place long enough to form connections or draw attention. He worked construction in Idaho, road maintenance in Washington, as a ranch hand in Oregon. He was quiet, competent enough to keep getting hired, strange enough that coworkers didn't socialize with him much. In 1982, at age 24, Victor was arrested for assaulting a 16-year-old girl he'd met at a bus stop. He'd offered her a ride, driven her to a remote area, and attacked her. She'd managed to escape and flagged down another driver. Victor was caught within hours, the victim's description and the vehicle registration making identification easy. He confessed, was convicted of assault and attempted kidnapping, and sentenced to 8 years in prison. He served 5. The prison psychologist who evaluated him before his parole hearing wrote that Victor demonstrated poor impulse control and an inability to empathize with victims. She recommended against early release. The parole board read her report and released him anyway. The prisons were overcrowded. Victor had been a model prisoner, no incidents, no fights. And 8 years for an assault where the victim had survived seemed like enough punishment. He walked out in 1987 with a bus ticket and a requirement to check in with a parole officer once a month. The parole system in the western states during the 1980s and 90s was a bureaucratic nightmare. Officers had caseloads of hundreds of parolees, making meaningful supervision impossible. Monthly check-ins consisted of a 10-minute conversation, a verification that the parolee had an address and a job, and a signature on a form. There was no monitoring between meetings, no system to track movement between jurisdictions, no way to know if a parolee had moved to another state unless they voluntarily reported it. Victor didn't voluntarily report much of anything. He moved frequently, taking jobs that paid cash, staying off official records whenever possible. He checked in with his parole officer when he had to, showing up sober and employed, saying the right things about rehabilitation and second chances. Then he'd disappear for another month, free to do whatever he wanted in a country where state lines meant different laws, different databases, different levels of attention. In 1989, 2 years after his release, a woman in rural Nevada was attacked in her home. She survived and gave police a description that matched Victor, who'd been working at a nearby ranch. By the time police went to question him, Victor had moved on. No forwarding address, no way to track him. The case went cold. In 1991, a teenage girl in Wyoming disappeared after leaving work. Her body was found 3 weeks later in a culvert off a highway. There was evidence of sexual assault and strangulation. Police had no suspects, no witnesses, no leads. The case went cold. In 1993, Victor's parole ended. He'd served his time, checked in when required, and was now free from supervision. To the system, he was a success story, someone who'd paid his debt and moved on with his life. In reality, he was a predator who'd learned how to game the system, how to stay invisible, how to move between jurisdictions faster than investigations could follow. It wasn't until 1996 that the pattern became visible, and even then, only barely. 9-year-old Lucas Moreno went missing from his foster home in northern Idaho. He'd been playing in the yard 1 minute and gone the next. The foster parents, who had 4 other children in their care, didn't realize he was missing for almost 2 hours. They assumed he'd wandered to a neighbor's house or gone to the park down the street. By the time they called police, the trail was cold. The search for Lucas involved hundreds of volunteers, tracking dogs, helicopters. They found his baseball cap near a creek 3 miles from the foster home. They found nothing else. Days became weeks. The case dominated local news, then faded as other stories took priority. Lucas Moreno became another picture on a missing child poster, another family destroyed by uncertainty, not knowing if their child was alive somewhere or if they should start the impossible process of mourning. 3 weeks after Lucas disappeared, a hiker found his body in a shallow grave near a hiking trail in a national forest. He'd been sexually assaulted and strangled. The crime scene was processed, evidence collected, but there were no witnesses, no DNA matches in the system, no obvious suspects. The case went cold within months. Another tragedy filed away in the growing stack of unsolved child murders. What investigators didn't know, because the systems weren't connected, was that Victor Halden had been living in a campground less than 10 miles from where Lucas was found. He'd been working off the books as a handyman, fixing cabins and clearing trails. Multiple people had seen him, talked to him, hired him for small jobs. But no one connected him to Lucas's disappearance because no one was looking at him. His parole had ended 3 years earlier. He wasn't on anyone's radar. Victor moved on. He worked his way through Montana, then down into Utah, then across to Colorado. He left a trail of victims that wouldn't be connected for years, disparate crimes in different jurisdictions that existed in separate filing cabinets and separate databases, puzzle pieces that no one knew belonged to the same puzzle. In 2005, the pattern finally broke in a way that couldn't be ignored. A family living in a remote cabin in the Colorado mountains was murdered in their home. The father, Michael Brennan, age 41, and the mother, Jennifer Brennan, age 38, were both shot execution style. Their 2 children, a girl of 11 and a boy of 8, were missing. The crime scene suggested they'd been taken alive. The Brennan murders made national news. A family slaughtered in their home, children abducted, a killer who'd left almost no evidence beyond the bullets and the blood. The FBI joined local law enforcement. A task force was formed. Every available resource was thrown at finding those children before it was too late, if it wasn't already. The boy, Christopher Brennan, was found 4 days later wandering on a highway 30 miles from the cabin. He was dehydrated, traumatized, barely able to speak. He'd been held somewhere dark, he told them, a basement or a cellar. A man had brought him food and water, but mostly left him alone. The man had taken his sister somewhere else. Christopher didn't know where. Then, just hours before he was found, the man had put him in a vehicle, driven for a while, and pushed him out on the side of the road, telling him to walk toward the sunrise. Christopher's description of his captor was detailed enough to work with. Male, older, maybe late 40s, graying hair, beard, quiet voice. The vehicle was a truck, dark-colored, with a camper shell. Christopher remembered a bumper sticker about fishing. These details went out to every law enforcement agency in the region. Roadblocks were set up. Helicopters searched the mountains and valleys. The girl, Sarah Brennan, was found 6 days after her brother, in a gas station bathroom 80 miles away. A woman had heard crying from the restroom, knocked, and found Sarah locked inside, bound with duct tape. She was alive, but had been sexually assaulted. She couldn't tell police much about where she'd been held. It was dark, underground, cold. The man had kept her blindfolded most of the time. But Sarah remembered something Christopher didn't. She remembered the man talking to himself, saying he needed to get rid of the truck, that they were looking for it. She remembered him saying a name, calling himself something that sounded like Victor or Vincent. And she remembered, in one brief moment when the blindfold had slipped, seeing a tattoo on his forearm, an eagle with spread wings, crude and faded, prison ink. The FBI ran the description and the tattoo through their databases. They cross-referenced known offenders in the region with violent histories. They looked for men named Victor or Vincent who might match. And in a file that had been gathering dust for years, they found Victor Halden. Last known address in Oregon, last known employment at a lumber mill, last contact with law enforcement when his parole ended in 1993. No current location, no current employment, nothing but a photograph from his prison release 12 years earlier. They distributed that photograph to media outlets and law enforcement agencies across 5 states. Within 24 hours, they had their first solid lead. A man matching Victor's description and driving a dark blue truck with a camper shell had been seen at a campground near the Wyoming-Colorado border. The campground owner remembered him because he'd paid cash for 2 weeks and hadn't interacted with other campers. The owner had thought it odd that a man alone would rent a site with electrical hookups big enough for a family RV. FBI agents descended on the campground. Victor's site was empty. He'd left in a hurry, leaving behind a propane tank and some camping chairs. But in the camper shell of an abandoned truck found 3 miles down a Forest Service road, they found evidence that tied Victor to the Brennan murders. Fibers that matched the carpet in the Brennan cabin, a child's jacket that Jennifer Brennan's mother identified as belonging to Sarah, and a handgun that ballistics would later match to the bullets that killed Michael and Jennifer. They also found something else, something that made the blood drain from every investigator's face. Victor had kept a journal, not of his crimes exactly, but of his movements and thoughts. Page after page of dates, locations, observations. He wrote about how easy it was to move through the country unnoticed, how the police in one state never talked to the police in the next state, how if you were careful and smart, you could do whatever you wanted. He wrote about his victims only in abstract terms, as opportunities and risks, cold calculations about whether the potential reward was worth the danger of being caught. And tucked into the back of the journal was a list of names. Some were crossed out. Investigators began the grim task of matching those names to cases. Lucas Moreno's name was on the list. So was the Nevada woman who'd survived her attack. So was the missing girl from Wyoming whose body had been found in a culvert. There were 12 names in total. 5 were crossed out. 7 were not, including Sarah and Christopher Brennan. The manhunt intensified. Victor Halden's face was on every news broadcast, every newspaper front page. Tips flooded in from across the country. The FBI tracked him through a series of credit card charges, small purchases at gas stations and convenience stores, a trail heading east. He was moving fast, abandoning his pattern of staying in rural areas, instead trying to disappear into cities where anonymity was easier. They caught him in a motel outside of Denver on a Wednesday morning. A desk clerk had recognized him from the news and called police. When officers surrounded the motel room, Victor was inside, watching television, eating a sandwich, acting as if this was just another day. He didn't resist arrest. He simply stood up, put his hands behind his back, and asked if he could finish his sandwich first. The officers said no. Victor Halden's arrest brought relief and rage in equal measure. The Brennan children were safe, physically at least, though the psychological wounds would take years, if not lifetimes, to heal. But the journal and the list of names opened up a nightmare of investigative work. Each name had to be verified, each case reopened, evidence re-examined. The families of victims who'd believed their loved ones' cases were cold suddenly found themselves thrust back into active investigations, reliving trauma they'd tried to bury. The Lucas Moreno case was one of the first to be reinvestigated. Detectives went back through their original notes, looked at the timeline, and realized that Victor had been living less than 10 miles away when Lucas disappeared. They interviewed people who remembered Victor from that time, including a woman who'd hired him to fix her porch. She described him as polite but strange, said he'd asked a lot of questions about the neighborhood, about which families had kids, which houses were empty during the day. At the time, she'd thought he was just making conversation. Now those questions felt like reconnaissance. DNA evidence from Lucas's clothing and the crime scene was retested with newer technology. They found a match to Victor Halden. The case that had been cold for 9 years suddenly had a suspect, a confession through the journal, and physical evidence. Lucas's foster parents, who'd spent nearly a decade wondering what happened, finally had answers. The answers didn't bring Lucas back, didn't make their grief easier, but at least they knew. At least someone would be held accountable. The same process repeated across multiple jurisdictions. The Nevada woman identified Victor from photographs. The Wyoming case yielded DNA evidence that matched. Slowly, methodically, investigators built a case that spanned 2 decades and dozens of victims. Some of the families had moved on as best they could, rebuilt their lives around the hole left by their missing loved one. Others had never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. For all of them, Victor's arrest was a cruel confirmation that their worst fears had been true all along. Victor's trial began in 2007, 2 years after his arrest. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had physical evidence, DNA, testimony from survivors, the journal, the list of names, decades of criminal history that showed a clear pattern of escalating violence. The defense tried to argue that Victor's childhood trauma had created a person who couldn't control his impulses, that he was sick rather than evil. Multiple psychiatrists examined him. Their reports painted a picture of a psychopath, someone who understood right and wrong intellectually, but felt no emotional connection to those concepts, no guilt, no remorse. The trial lasted 6 months, one of the longest criminal trials in Colorado history. The prosecution called over 100 witnesses. They presented evidence from 8 different murder cases, 3 attempted murders, and multiple assaults. They showed the jury crime scene photos, autopsy reports, testimony from victims who'd survived and families of those who hadn't. It was emotionally exhausting for everyone involved, a marathon of horror that felt designed to break the spirit of anyone who sat through it. Victor Halden showed no emotion during any of it. He sat at the defense table, taking notes occasionally, whispering to his lawyers, but never crying, never showing anger or sadness or fear. When survivors testified, describing in detail what he'd done to them, he watched with what looked like mild curiosity, as if they were describing something that had happened to someone else. When crime scene photos were shown, he looked at them calmly, professionally, like a craftsman reviewing his work. The jury found him guilty on every count. The sentencing phase began immediately. The prosecution sought the death penalty for the murders of Michael and Jennifer Brennan, arguing that the crime was especially heinous because it involved the kidnapping and assault of their children. The defense argued for life in prison, claiming that execution would be too lenient, that Victor should spend the rest of his life in maximum security where he could never hurt anyone again, but would have to live every day knowing he'd failed. The judge sentenced Victor Halden to death. But in a legal twist, because multiple jurisdictions had claims on him for different murders, he was also sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences without parole. Even if the death penalty was overturned on appeal, Victor would never see freedom again. He was transferred to a maximum security prison to await execution, a process that in Colorado meant years if not decades of automatic appeals. But Victor Halden never made it to the execution chamber. In 2011, for years into his death row stay, he died of a heart attack in his cell. He was 53 years old. Some people called it justice, others called it too easy an ending. The families of his victims had mixed reactions. Some were relieved that they wouldn't have to endure more appeals, more hearings, more years of waiting for closure. Others felt cheated that Victor got to die on his own terms rather than facing the execution he'd been sentenced to. The aftermath of Victor's case led to significant changes in how law enforcement tracks repeat offenders across state lines. The FBI created a national database specifically for violent offenders on parole or probation, allowing agencies to share information in real time. States began requiring more frequent check-ins and GPS monitoring for certain categories of offenders. Parole boards started giving more weight to psychiatric evaluations and patterns of behavior rather than just time served and prison conduct. These changes came too late for Lucas Moreno, for the Brennan family, for the dozen other victims whose names were in Victor's journal. But they represented a recognition that the system had failed catastrophically, that someone like Victor Halden should never have been able to move through the country freely for 2 decades, leaving a trail of bodies and shattered lives behind him. The question that haunted everyone involved in Victor's case was simple and impossible. Why wasn't he stopped sooner? The warning signs were there from the beginning. The violent behavior as a teenager, the assault that sent him to juvenile detention, the prison psychologist who specifically recommended against parole. Every person who evaluated Victor Halden saw the danger, documented the danger, and then watched as the system ignored those warnings and let him go free. Part of the answer was bureaucratic. The systems for tracking offenders across jurisdictions didn't exist or didn't function well. Information that could have connected Victor to multiple crimes was trapped in separate databases that didn't communicate with each other. A detective in Idaho had no easy way to know about a similar crime in Wyoming or Colorado. The technology existed to share information, but the institutional structures to use that technology effectively didn't. Part of the answer was resource-based. Parole officers were overwhelmed with caseloads that made meaningful supervision impossible. Even when officers had concerns about a parolee, they often lacked the time or authority to act on those concerns beyond filing another report that would be read and filed away. Prisons were overcrowded, creating pressure to release inmates early to make room for new ones. The entire system was designed to process people through rather than to actually rehabilitate or monitor them. But part of the answer was also philosophical. The criminal justice system operates on the principle that people who've served their sentences deserve a second chance, that punishment should be finite, that redemption is possible. These are important principles, foundational to the idea of justice as something other than pure revenge. But they create a tension when applied to someone like Victor Halden, someone who every psychiatric evaluation said was dangerous, someone whose pattern of behavior suggested they would offend again. How do you balance the principle of redemption against the safety of potential future victims? Victor's case didn't resolve that tension. It just made it more visible, more urgent. The changes to tracking and supervision that followed his arrest were attempts to thread that needle, to maintain the possibility of redemption while also maintaining public safety. Whether those changes worked is difficult to measure. We know the crimes that happen. We can't count the ones that don't. For the families of Victor's victims, the systemic explanations felt like excuses. Their loved ones were dead because people who should have been watching Victor weren't watching closely enough, because information that should have been shared wasn't shared, because someone decided that Victor Halden deserved another chance even after multiple chances had already been wasted. The policy changes, the new databases, the increased monitoring, all of it felt like small consolation for losses that could never be recovered. Sarah and Christopher Brennan were placed in foster care after their parents' murders. They were eventually adopted by Jennifer's sister and her husband, who tried to give them a normal life despite everything they'd endured. Christopher struggled with PTSD and anxiety, had difficulty forming attachments, cycled through therapists trying to find someone who could help him make sense of what had happened. Sarah retreated into silence for years, barely speaking, using art and music to express things she couldn't verbalize. Both children grew up carrying the weight of Victor Halden's crimes. They carried their parents' deaths, the trauma of captivity, the knowledge that they'd survived when others hadn't. In interviews given years later as adults, they both said they didn't blame the police or the FBI or even the parole board that had released Victor decades earlier. They understood that the failures were systemic rather than individual. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. Their parents were still gone. Their childhoods were still destroyed. No amount of policy reform would change that. The third case we need to examine is different in nature, but similar in its revelation of systemic failure. If Emily Hartwell's case showed us that surveillance alone isn't protection, and Victor Halden's case showed us that knowing someone is dangerous isn't the same as stopping them, then Hannah Pierce's case shows us something even more uncomfortable, that not all violence comes from predators. Sometimes it comes from children who make terrible decisions in moments of panic, and our system has no good way to handle that truth. Riverbend Township was smaller than Bayshore Heights, maybe 8,000 people spread across a rural area where farms and forest met scattered neighborhoods. The kind of place where high school football games were major social events, and everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. In the fall of 2011, that small-town intimacy would become a curse as a local tragedy tore through the community, dividing it in ways that still haven't fully healed. Hannah Pierce was 15 years old when she died. She'd been adopted at age 7 from the foster system by Mark and Linda Pierce, a couple who'd wanted children but couldn't have them biologically. The adoption was supposed to be a happy ending to a difficult beginning. Hannah's early childhood had been marked by neglect and instability, multiple foster placements, attachment issues that made forming bonds difficult. The Pierces worked hard to give her stability, got her into therapy, loved her as fiercely as they knew how. But Hannah carried wounds that love alone couldn't heal. She struggled in school, not academically, but socially. She didn't quite know how to read social cues, came on too strong or pulled back too hard, scared off potential friends with an intensity that spoke to how badly she wanted connection. By the time she was in high school, she'd learned to protect herself by not trying too hard, by accepting isolation as safer than rejection. Until she met Evan Cole. Evan was 14, a year younger than Hannah, small for his age in a way that made him a target for bullying. He was quiet, artistic, spent lunch periods in the art room drawing elaborate fantasy landscapes. He and Hannah bonded over their outsider status, started sitting together at lunch, texting constantly, building the kind of intense adolescent relationship where everything feels cosmic and permanent. For both of them, finally having someone who understood felt like salvation. The relationship worried Hannah's parents and Evan's mother. The intensity was concerning. The way the two teenagers seemed to exist in their own world, shutting out everyone else. But both sets of parents also remembered being teenagers, remembered how big everything felt at that age. They talked to their kids about boundaries and appropriate behavior, kept an eye on things, but ultimately decided that forbidding the relationship would only drive it underground. Better to let it run its course naturally. In late October, Hannah began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her period was late, and she'd been feeling nauseous in the mornings. She was terrified but also oddly hopeful. In her mind, shaped by years of seeking belonging, a baby meant family, permanence, proof that she mattered to someone in a way that couldn't be undone. She didn't think about the reality of being a 15-year-old mother, the challenges or consequences. She just thought about not being alone anymore. She told Evan on a Friday evening in early November. They met by the river, a spot where local teenagers went to hang out away from adult supervision. It was getting dark, cold, the kind of autumn evening where you can see your breath. Hannah told Evan she thought she was pregnant, that they were going to have a baby, that everything was going to be okay because they had each other. Evan's reaction was not what she expected. He didn't share her hope or her certainty. He was terrified, immediately and completely. He was 14 years old, barely keeping his grades up, bullied at school, dependent on his mother for everything. The idea of being a father was so far outside his reality that he couldn't process it. He told Hannah she must be wrong, that it couldn't be true, that they had to fix this somehow. Hannah, feeling his panic, tried to reassure him. She told him they'd figure it out together, that their parents would help, that it would be okay. But Evan was spiraling, his fear feeding on itself. He'd grown up in a strict household where his mother had drilled into him the importance of education, of not making the mistakes she'd made as a young woman, of not throwing his life away. The thought of telling her he'd gotten a girl pregnant felt impossible. What happened next would be debated in court, analyzed by psychologists, argued over in op-eds and comment sections for years. The exact sequence of events was never fully clear because only one person survived to tell the story, and trauma and self-preservation color memory. But the general outline was this. Evan and Hannah argued by the river. Evan said things he'd later claim he didn't mean, about how Hannah had ruined his life, how he wished he'd never met her. Hannah, already fragile, already carrying wounds from a childhood of abandonment, heard these words as confirmation of her deepest fear, that she was unlovable, disposable, destined to always be left behind. She might have said she was going to tell everyone. She might have said she'd make sure everyone knew what they'd done. Or she might have just cried and tried to hug him while he tried to pull away. Different reconstructions of those moments exist, based on forensic evidence and Evan's multiple statements that changed over time. What's certain is that at some point, Evan picked up a rock from the riverbank and hit Hannah with it. He hit her hard enough to fracture her skull. She fell, probably lost consciousness immediately. And then, in what Evan would later describe as a fog of panic, he hit her again, and again, until he was certain she wasn't going to get up, wasn't going to tell anyone, wasn't going to ruin his life the way he believed she was about to. Evan left Hannah's body by the river and went home. He went inside his house, ate dinner with his mother, did his homework, went to bed. The next morning, he got up and went to school like it was any other Saturday for a school event. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. He tried to act normal, tried to pretend the previous night hadn't occurred. He might have succeeded if he hadn't made one mistake. At the river, struggling with Hannah, his shoe had come off. It was a distinctive shoe, a sneaker with a custom design he'd drawn on himself, Sharpie artwork that was uniquely his. He'd left it behind in the dark, in his panic to get away from what he'd done. That shoe would be his undoing. Hannah Pierce was reported missing Saturday morning when she didn't come home Friday night. Her parents had assumed she was at a friend's house, which she'd done before with permission. When she still wasn't home by noon, they started calling her friends. No one had seen her. Her phone went straight to voicemail. The Pierces called the police by early afternoon. Local law enforcement began a search immediately. They knew Hannah, knew her history, knew that a missing teenager with her background was a serious concern. They organized volunteers, covered the obvious locations, and by evening, they'd found her body by the river. The cause of death was obvious even before the medical examiner arrived. Hannah had been beaten with a blunt object, her skull crushed, blood pooled on the rocks beneath her. They found Evan's shoe 20 feet away from Hannah's body. The custom artwork on the side made identification easy. Detectives knew Evan, knew he and Hannah had been in a relationship. They went to his house Sunday morning. Evan was eating breakfast when they knocked. His mother answered, confused about why police would be at her door. They asked to speak with Evan. He came to the door, still holding a piece of toast. The detective, a man named Robert Chun who'd worked juvenile cases for 15 years, took one look at Evan's face and knew. Evan wasn't a practiced liar. His guilt was written across him in the tension of his shoulders, the way he couldn't meet Chen's eyes. When Chen asked if Evan was missing a shoe, Evan's face crumbled. He started crying and couldn't stop. They took him to the station with his mother. She sat in the interview room with him, her hand on his shoulder, her face pale with growing horror as her son confessed to killing Hannah Pierce. Evan's statement was halting and confused, jumping between self-justification and remorse, trying to explain what had happened while barely understanding it himself. He said Hannah had threatened to tell everyone about the pregnancy. He said he panicked. He said he didn't mean to kill her, just to make her stop talking. He said he didn't know what came over him. The medical examiner's report would later show that Hannah Pierce was not pregnant. The nausea and missed period had been stress and hormonal fluctuation, normal things that happen to teenage girls. She died believing she was carrying Evan's child, and he'd killed her based on that same false belief. If either of them had access to a pregnancy test, if Hannah had waited to tell Evan until she was sure, if there'd been any adult they felt comfortable talking to, Hannah Pierce might have lived to adulthood. But adolescence doesn't come with that kind of patience or perspective. The Riverbend community reacted to Hannah's murder with shock and division. Some people saw Evan as a monster, a murderer who deserved the harshest punishment possible. They organized vigils for Hannah, demanded that Evan be tried as an adult, called for justice that looked like revenge. Others saw Evan as a child who'd made a terrible mistake, who'd panicked and done something irreversible in a moment of fear. They pointed to his age, his size, his own vulnerability. They asked what punishing him as an adult would accomplish beyond destroying another young life. The prosecutor's office had to decide whether to charge Evan Cole as a juvenile or as an adult. This decision would determine everything about his future. In the juvenile system, the focus would be on rehabilitation. He'd potentially be released at age 21, his record sealed, given a chance to rebuild his life. In the adult system, he'd face decades in prison, no possibility of sealing his record, no emphasis on rehabilitation over punishment. The decision came down to what the state believed about Evan Cole. Was he a child who'd made a catastrophic error in judgment, whose brain wasn't fully developed, who deserved a chance at redemption? Or was he a murderer whose crime was so severe that his age shouldn't shield him from full adult consequences? The prosecutor, a woman named Margaret Reynolds who'd been doing this job for 20 years, struggled with the decision. She met with Hannah's parents, with Evan's mother, with psychologists and legal experts. Everyone had an opinion. None of them made the choice easier. Reynolds ultimately decided to charge Evan as an adult. Her reasoning, laid out in a press conference that was carried live on local news, was that the severity of the crime demanded adult consequences. Hannah Pierce had been murdered, intentionally and brutally. She'd been hit multiple times, which suggested deliberation rather than a single impulsive act. And Evan had left her body and gone home, showing a consciousness of guilt and an ability to hide his actions. These factors, Reynolds argued, indicated a level of culpability that went beyond childish mistake. The defense argued strenuously against this decision. They filed motions to transfer the case to juvenile court, presenting expert testimony about adolescent brain development. Neuroscientists explained that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and decision-making, doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. Teenagers literally cannot evaluate consequences the way adults do. Their brains are wired to take risks, to prioritize immediate peer relationships over long-term outcomes, to respond to emotional situations with emotion rather than reason. Charging Evan as an adult, the defense argued, ignored biological reality. But the judge denied the motion. Evan Cole would be tried as an adult for the murder of Hannah Pierce. The trial began in the spring of 2012. It lasted 3 weeks, though the outcome was never really in doubt. Evan's confession was clear and detailed. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The only real questions were about intent and sentencing. The prosecution painted Evan as someone who'd killed to protect himself, who'd made a calculated decision to end Hannah's life rather than face the consequences of their relationship. They showed the jury crime scene photos, had the medical examiner describe Hannah's injuries in clinical detail. They called Hannah's parents, who testified about their daughter's struggles and dreams, about how hard she'd worked to overcome her difficult start in life, about the future that had been stolen from her. The defense presented Evan as a frightened child who'd made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. They had psychologists testify about his emotional immaturity, his lack of criminal history, his good behavior in school and at home. They argued that what happened by the river was not premeditated murder, but a tragic accident born of adolescent fear and poor judgment. They asked the jury to consider rehabilitation over pure punishment. Evan testified in his own defense, something his lawyers had debated extensively before deciding the jury needed to hear directly from him. He was small on the witness stand, his voice quiet, his face still showing the remnants of childhood even as he sat in an adult courtroom being tried for an adult crime. He cried as he described what had happened, said over and over that he didn't mean to kill Hannah, that he loved her, that he'd do anything to take it back. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found Evan Cole guilty of second-degree murder. Not first-degree, which would have required proof of premeditation, but second-degree, which recognized the killing was intentional but not planned in advance. The sentencing phase began immediately. The prosecution asked for 25 years to life. The defense asked for the minimum sentence of 15 years with the possibility of parole. The judge, a man named Thomas Whitaker who'd presided over dozens of juvenile cases, took a week to consider the sentence. When court reconvened, he delivered a statement that tried to balance justice for Hannah with recognition of Evan's age. He sentenced Evan Cole to 15 years to life, meaning he'd serve a minimum of 15 years before becoming eligible for parole, at which point a board would decide if he'd been sufficiently rehabilitated to safely return to society. Evan would be 29 years old at his first parole hearing. If he survived that long in the adult prison system, where young offenders are particularly vulnerable, Evan was transferred to a maximum security facility that housed both adult and juvenile offenders. He was placed in a unit with other teenage inmates, kept separate from the general population for his own safety. Reports from his first years inside described a young man struggling with guilt and depression, barely eating, having nightmares that kept his cellmates awake. He attempted suicide twice in his first year, once by hanging and once by cutting. Both times he was saved by guards who found him in time. The question of whether Evan Cole should have been tried as an adult continues to be debated. Advocates for juvenile justice reform point to his case as an example of a system that fails to account for developmental science, that treats children as miniature adults rather than recognizing their fundamental differences. They argue that 15 years in adult prison will not rehabilitate Evan, but will instead harden him, expose him to violence and trauma that will make him more dangerous, not less, when he's eventually released. Others argue that Hannah Pierce deserves justice that matches the severity of what was done to her, that being 14 years old doesn't give someone a free pass to commit murder. They point out that Hannah was only 15, also a child, also dealing with adolescent emotions and underdeveloped judgment. If Evan's age should be a mitigating factor in his punishment, shouldn't Hannah's age be an aggravating factor in his crime? She was a vulnerable child who trusted him, and he killed her. That deserves serious consequences, regardless of his brain development. There's no easy answer to this tension. The law tries to balance it by allowing judges and juries to consider age as a factor without making it the only factor, by creating separate juvenile and adult systems while maintaining the possibility of transfer between them. But cases like Evan and Hannah's reveal the inadequacy of these compromises. Evan Cole will likely spend his entire youth and early adulthood in prison. He'll be released, if he's released, as a middle-aged man with no work history, no education beyond what he can get behind bars, and a murder conviction that will follow him forever. Is that justice? Is that rehabilitation? Or is it just a way to make ourselves feel like we did something when faced with tragedy that has no good solution? Hannah Pierce's parents maintain that Evan's age is irrelevant. Their daughter is dead. She'll never graduate high school, never go to college, never fall in love again, never have the chance to become whoever she might have been. The Pierces established a scholarship in Hannah's name for students who've overcome difficult circumstances, trying to create something positive from their loss. They don't attend Evan's parole hearings, don't want to be part of that process. They said their piece at his sentencing and have tried to move forward, though Mark Pierce has said moving forward feels like betrayal, like leaving Hannah behind. The fourth case we need to examine takes us even deeper into uncomfortable territory. If Evan Cole's case asks us to grapple with how we punish children who commit adult crimes, Daniel Sloan's case asks us to confront what happens when the person who commits violence is, in a very real sense, not in control of their own mind. This is where our concepts of guilt, punishment, and justice become most strained, where the question of accountability collides with the reality of severe mental illness. Harbor Pines was a middle-class suburb, the kind of place where lawns were manicured and everyone's Christmas lights went up the day after Thanksgiving. Margaret Sloan had lived there for 15 years, taught 5th grade at the local elementary school, was known as the teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, who bought supplies with her own money when the school budget ran short. She had a son, Daniel, who was 17 in the winter of 2012. To the outside world, they were a normal family, maybe quieter than some, maybe more private, but fundamentally ordinary. What people didn't see was that Daniel had been struggling with his mental health for over a year. It started small, or what seemed small at the time. He became more withdrawn, spent hours in his room with the door closed. He stopped hanging out with friends, stopped participating in the activities he used to enjoy. Margaret assumed it was typical teenage behavior, that phase where kids pull away from their parents and live inside their own heads. She gave him space, trusted that he'd come back around. But Daniel wasn't going through a typical teenage phase. He was beginning to experience symptoms of what would later be diagnosed as schizophrenia with paranoid features. He was hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there, developing elaborate delusional systems about who was watching him and why. He believed his phone was bugged, that his teachers were agents of some vague conspiracy, that his mother was being controlled by outside forces trying to harm him. He kept these beliefs mostly to himself, knowing on some level that saying them out loud would make people worry, possibly take him away to somewhere he didn't want to go. Margaret did notice some warning signs. Daniel talked about feeling watched, asked strange questions about whether she'd moved things in his room. He became obsessed with locking doors and windows, checking them repeatedly before he could relax. He started having trouble sleeping, and Margaret would find him in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, standing in the dark, just staring out the window. When she'd ask what was wrong, he'd say he couldn't sleep, that he was thinking too much. She scheduled an appointment with their family doctor, thinking maybe Daniel was depressed, maybe he needed therapy or medication. The appointment was scheduled for January 5th. Daniel and Margaret never made it to that appointment. On Christmas Eve, something in Daniel's fractured psyche reached a breaking point. He'd been in his room for most of the day, and Margaret could hear him talking to someone, though when she knocked and asked who he was talking to, he said no one. He was just on the phone. Later, she'd realized he'd been arguing with the voices, trying to negotiate with delusions that were becoming more aggressive, more commanding. That evening, Margaret was in the kitchen preparing dinner. It was just the two of them for Christmas. Daniel's father had left years ago, and Margaret's parents were both deceased. She was making Daniel's favorite meal, trying to create some sense of normalcy, some connection with a son who felt increasingly like a stranger. She didn't hear Daniel come downstairs. She didn't hear him pick up the baseball bat from the hall closet. She didn't have any warning at all before he swung it at the back of her head. The first blow didn't kill her, but it knocked her unconscious. Daniel would later tell psychiatrists that he didn't remember the attack clearly, that it felt like watching someone else do it, like he was outside his body observing. The voices had told him that Margaret was an imposter, that his real mother had been replaced with something dangerous that was going to hurt him. He believed he was defending himself, protecting himself from a threat that existed only in his mind. He hit her multiple times. The medical examiner would count 6 separate impacts, any one of which could have been fatal. When Daniel finally stopped, Margaret Sloan was dead on her kitchen floor, the dinner she'd been making still on the stove. Daniel stood over her body, the bat still in his hands, slowly coming back to some version of awareness. He later said that's when the voices stopped, suddenly and completely, leaving him in silence that was somehow worse than the noise had been. He called 911 at 6:47 p.m. The call was calm and confused, Daniel reporting that his mother was hurt, that something bad had happened, that he needed help. The dispatcher kept him on the line, asking questions, trying to understand the situation. Daniel told her he'd hurt his mother. He didn't say why. He didn't understand why himself. By the time police arrived 8 minutes later, Daniel was sitting on the front porch, the bat beside him, his hands covered in blood, crying silently. The responding officers secured the scene and found Margaret inside. One officer stayed with Daniel, who was compliant and docile, answering questions in a flat voice that suggested shock or something deeper. He admitted immediately that he'd attacked his mother. He couldn't explain why when asked. He just kept saying he had to, that it was necessary, that they wouldn't understand. Daniel was arrested and taken to the county jail. Within hours, it became clear to the officers and jail staff that something was seriously wrong with him. He talked to people who weren't there, responded to voices no one else could hear, made references to conspiracies and threats that made no sense. The jail's medical staff, accustomed to dealing with mentally ill inmates, recognized the signs of acute psychosis. They recommended immediate psychiatric evaluation. Daniel was transferred to a secure psychiatric facility for evaluation while the legal process began. A team of psychiatrists examined him over several days, conducting interviews, reviewing his history, administering tests. Their conclusion was unanimous. Daniel Sloan was severely mentally ill, suffering from schizophrenia that had likely been developing for over a year. At the time he attacked his mother, he was experiencing active psychosis, including command hallucinations, voices telling him to act, and paranoid delusions. He genuinely believed his mother was a threat to him, that he was acting in self-defense against an imposter. This diagnosis changed the nature of the case dramatically. The question was no longer whether Daniel killed his mother, the evidence for that was overwhelming, but whether he could be held criminally responsible for an act committed while he was psychotic. The legal standard for this determination is called the insanity defense, and it's one of the most controversial aspects of criminal law. The insanity defense isn't about whether someone is mentally ill. Many people who commit crimes have mental health issues, and that alone doesn't excuse their actions. The insanity defense is about whether someone, at the moment they committed a crime, could understand that what they were doing was wrong. If psychosis was so severe that they couldn't distinguish reality from delusion, couldn't understand the moral or legal wrongness of their actions, then they can't be held criminally responsible in the same way someone who acted with full awareness would be. Daniel's trial became less about guilt and more about the nature of responsibility itself. The prosecution had to prove that Daniel knew what he was doing was wrong. The defense had to prove that his psychosis was so severe that he couldn't form criminal intent. Both sides brought in psychiatric experts. Both sides presented evidence. But the real argument was philosophical. What do we do with someone who commits a terrible act while their mind is broken? The prosecution's psychiatrists argued that Daniel had some level of awareness during the attack. He'd chosen a weapon, the baseball bat. He'd waited until his mother's back was turned. After the attack, he'd called 911. which showed he understood he'd done something wrong. These actions, they argued, demonstrated enough cognitive function to establish criminal responsibility, even if Daniel was mentally ill. The defense's psychiatrist countered that everything Daniel did was filtered through his psychotic delusions. He chose a weapon because the voices told him he was in danger and needed to protect himself. He waited for his mother's back to be turned because his delusion told him she was a threat, and he needed the advantage of surprise. He called 911 because once the voices stopped, he was horrified by what had happened, but that horror came after the fact, not during the attack itself. During the attack, he was not Daniel Sloan the rational person, but Daniel Sloan the psychotic patient acting on hallucinations and delusions. The jury heard testimony from teachers who'd known Daniel since he was a child, who described a gentle kid who'd never shown violence, who'd been struggling but had seemed like he'd just been stressed. They heard from neighbors who said Margaret was a devoted mother, that she and Daniel had seemed close. They heard from psychiatrists who explained how schizophrenia typically emerges in late adolescence or early adulthood, how it can transform someone almost overnight, how Daniel's behavior in the months before the attack fit the pattern of a first psychotic break. Most powerfully, they heard from Daniel himself. He testified about the voices, about the delusions, about how real everything had seemed in the moment. He cried as he described his mother, how much he loved her, how he'd give anything to undo what happened. He explained that he knew intellectually that his mother wasn't an imposter, that the conspiracy wasn't real, but that during the attack, those delusions had been his reality. He couldn't separate what was real from what the illness was telling him. He was, in the most literal sense, not in his right mind. The trial lasted 5 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Their verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. Daniel Sloan would not go to prison. Instead, he would be committed to a secure psychiatric hospital indefinitely, held there until psychiatrists determined he was no longer a danger to himself or others. In practice, this often means decades of institutionalization, sometimes for life. The verdict wasn't acquittal so much as a different form of confinement, one focused on treatment rather than punishment. The public reaction to Daniel's verdict was divided and emotional. Many people understood the reasoning behind it, accepted that punishing someone for actions taken during severe psychosis doesn't serve justice or public safety. If Daniel had been sent to prison, he would have been a mentally ill inmate in a system poorly equipped to treat him, likely to be victimized or to decompensate further. The psychiatric hospital gave him a chance at stabilization, treatment, possibly eventual recovery. But others were outraged. Margaret Sloan was dead, murdered by her own son in her own home. That he was mentally ill when he did it didn't bring her back, didn't undo the violence, didn't change the fact that a dedicated teacher and loving mother had died terribly and alone. To some people, the insanity verdict felt like Daniel was getting away with murder, that he'd found a legal loophole that allowed him to avoid responsibility. The controversy intensified years later when Daniel began the process of petitioning for release. After 8 years in the psychiatric hospital, he'd been stabilized on medication, had undergone extensive therapy, and his psychiatrist believed he was no longer a danger. He'd never had another violent incident. He participated fully in his treatment. He expressed genuine remorse for his mother's death, understanding now what his psychosis had prevented him from understanding then. According to every clinical measure, he was ready for supervised release into a group home setting. The petition for release became a media story. Victims' rights advocates protested, arguing that 8 years was not sufficient for taking a life, regardless of mental illness. They questioned whether someone who'd killed their own mother could ever be trusted not to be violent again. They raised concerns about what would happen if Daniel stopped taking his medication, if he had another psychotic break. Mental health advocates countered that Daniel had been treated, not merely warehoused, that he'd done everything asked of him in terms of accepting treatment and taking responsibility. They argued that keeping him institutionalized longer than clinically necessary would be unjust, that the goal should be rehabilitation and safe reintegration, not punishment. The court held hearings on Daniel's petition. Psychiatrists testified about his progress, his medication compliance, his understanding of his illness, and the importance of continued treatment. They proposed a careful release plan. Daniel would live in a supervised group home, attend regular psychiatric appointments, remain on medication monitored by staff, have his activities and whereabouts tracked. He would essentially be on a long-term medical parole, his freedom conditional on continued stability. The judge ultimately approved a gradual release plan. Daniel would spend 6 months in a transitional program, then move to the supervised group home if all went well. He was released to the transitional program in 2020, 8.5 years after he killed his mother. He was 26 years old, had spent nearly a third of his life institutionalized, and was trying to build an adult life around the wreckage of what he'd done as a psychotic teenager. Daniel's story doesn't have a neat ending because he's still living it. He's been in the community for several years now without incident. He works part-time at a bookstore, chosen specifically because his mother had loved books, a way of honoring her memory. He attends support groups for people with serious mental illness, shares his story to help others understand the importance of early intervention and treatment. He lives with the knowledge of what he did, carries it every day, but also lives with the understanding that the Daniel who killed Margaret Sloan was not the Daniel who exists now, medicated and stable and fully aware. This case raises questions our justice system still struggles to answer. How do we hold people accountable for actions taken during psychosis? What does justice look like when the perpetrator and victim were both destroyed by an illness neither one chose? How long should someone be institutionalized when they're no longer clinically ill? And perhaps most troublingly, how do we prevent these tragedies when families often don't recognize the warning signs of serious mental illness until it's too late? Margaret Sloan had noticed Daniel withdrawing, acting strangely, but she'd interpreted it as teenage moodiness rather than mental illness. She'd scheduled a doctor's appointment, but it came too late. Would earlier intervention have prevented her death? Possibly. Mental health professionals emphasize that schizophrenia is treatable, especially when caught early. Medication and therapy can manage symptoms, allow people to live productive lives. But the illness often emerges during adolescence or early adulthood, a time when changes in behavior can easily be attributed to normal developmental phases. By the time families realize something is seriously wrong, first psychotic episodes may have already occurred. The systems meant to identify and treat serious mental illness are underfunded and overwhelmed. Schools have limited access to mental health professionals. Primary care doctors receive minimal training in recognizing psychiatric emergencies. Insurance often limits mental health coverage in ways that make intensive treatment prohibitively expensive. And stigma prevents many people from seeking help even when they recognize something is wrong. We've created a society where someone like Daniel Sloan can slip through the cracks until tragedy forces the system to pay attention. The final case we need to examine brings us back to where we started with Emily Hartwell's story, the intersection of surveillance, supervision, and violent predators. But where Emily's case was about a moment of opportunistic violence captured on camera, Laura Kensington's case shows us what happens when someone who's supposed to be watched isn't watched carefully enough, when the systems designed to track dangerous individuals fail at the most basic level. North Elmwood was a quiet residential area, mostly families and retirees, the kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked and kids played outside without supervision. Laura Kensington, 56 years old, had lived there for 20 years. She was a caregiver by profession and by nature, working with elderly clients who needed help with daily tasks, and occasionally providing respite care for families with special needs children. She was trusted implicitly by everyone who knew her, the kind of person you'd call in an emergency without hesitation. In March of 2016, Laura took on a new client, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who lived alone and needed help with housekeeping and meal preparation. The job was straightforward, a few hours 3 times a week. Laura had done similar work dozens of times. She showed up on time, did her work efficiently, and made Mrs. Patterson's life a little easier. It was the kind of job Laura loved, quietly making a difference in someone's life. What Laura didn't know was that she'd been noticed by someone who'd been watching the neighborhood for weeks. Marcus Hale was 30 years old, recently released from federal prison after serving 8 years for armed robbery and assault. He was on supervised release, which meant he was supposed to check in regularly with a federal probation officer, maintain employment, avoid contact with known criminals, and stay within his designated district without permission to travel. In theory, Marcus was being monitored to ensure he didn't reoffend. In practice, the supervision was minimal at best. Marcus's probation officer had a caseload of over 200 supervises. Monthly check-ins lasted 15 minutes, sometimes less. The officer verified Marcus had an address and asked if he'd found employment. Marcus always said yes to both, though his employment was sporadic and his housing situation unstable. The officer didn't have time to verify these claims beyond the most basic checks. Marcus could have been doing almost anything in the weeks between meetings, and as long as he showed up when required and said the right things, no one was paying close attention. Marcus had spent his time in prison becoming more dangerous, not less. He'd been involved in violent incidents inside, had spent time in solitary confinement, had been released with minimal preparation or support for re-entry. The violence he'd committed before prison armed robbery, where he'd beaten the victim, had been opportunistic, fueled by drug addiction and financial desperation. The violence he was capable of now was colder, more controlled, the product of years of institutionalization and hardening. He'd chosen North Elmwood deliberately, moving into a boarding house on the edge of the neighborhood where rents were cheap and questions were few. He watched the patterns of daily life, noting who came and went, which houses had women living alone, which had security systems, which didn't. He was patient, methodical, planning something he hadn't fully defined yet, but knew would involve violence. He'd decided, somewhere in the dark calculus of his thinking, that he had nothing to lose. He'd already spent years in prison. Going back didn't frighten him, and the anger he carried at the world, at the system, at his own wasted life, needed an outlet. Laura Kensington became that outlet through nothing more than bad luck and Marcus's observation that she worked in the neighborhood, that she had a routine, that she seemed kind and therefore vulnerable. He followed her over several days, learning where she lived, what time she left for work, when she was alone. He learned which clients she visited and when. He formulated a plan that was simple and brutal. He would take her, use her ATM card to withdraw cash, and then dispose of her in a way that would buy him time to disappear before anyone realized she was missing. On a Wednesday evening in late March, Laura left Mrs. Patterson's house at her usual time, 6 o'clock. She walked to her car, a 10-year-old sedan parked on the street. Marcus was waiting nearby. When Laura opened her car door, Marcus appeared behind her with a knife, telling her quietly to get in the passenger's side, that if she screamed or fought he'd kill her right there. Laura, terrified but trying to stay calm, complied. Marcus got in the driver's seat and drove away from the neighborhood with Laura held at knife point beside him. Over the next several hours, Marcus forced Laura to provide her ATM PIN, then drove to multiple ATMs withdrawing the daily maximum from each. Security cameras captured these transactions, showing Marcus at the machines while Laura sat in the passenger seat, her face visible in some frames, her fear obvious to anyone who looked closely. But these transactions happened at night, and no one was monitoring the footage in real time. The images would only be reviewed after Laura was reported missing. After the withdrawals, Marcus drove to a remote area outside city limits. What happened there was brutal and final. The details were later reconstructed from forensic evidence, but they need not be described in detail here. Laura Kensington was raped and strangled. Marcus left her body in a shallow ditch beside a service road, covering it hastily with brush. He abandoned her car several miles away, wiping down surfaces to remove fingerprints, though he missed several. Then he returned to his boarding house and went to sleep as if he'd spent an ordinary evening. Laura was reported missing Thursday morning when she didn't show up for her first client appointment. The client called Laura's cell phone repeatedly, then called the care agency Laura worked for. The agency tried Laura's home phone and cell, got no answer, and eventually called her sister, who had a key to Laura's apartment. The sister found the apartment empty, Laura's bed unslept in, her phone and purse missing. She called police immediately. The investigation moved quickly once Laura's car was found Thursday afternoon. Security footage from the ATMs was pulled and reviewed. Detectives saw Laura in the passenger seat, saw an unknown male making the withdrawals. The timeline was established. Laura had been abducted around 6 p.m. Wednesday, forced to give up her PIN, and then driven around to multiple ATMs. After the last withdrawal at 9:47 p.m., the trail went cold. Every law enforcement agency in the region was alerted. Laura's photo was distributed to media outlets. Volunteers organized search parties. Laura's sister made a tearful plea on local news, begging whoever had taken Laura to let her go, promising no judgment, just wanting her sister back safely. But even as these efforts were underway, investigators feared they were already too late. The pattern of ATM withdrawals, the abandoned car, the lack of contact or ransom demand, all pointed to a kidnapping that had ended in murder. The break in the case came from the security footage. The FBI's facial recognition software was run on the images of the man at the ATMs. The system flagged a possible match: Marcus Hale, recently released federal inmate on supervised release. His probation file was pulled and reviewed. Detectives learned he was living less than 2 miles from where Laura's car had been abandoned. They obtained a warrant and went to the boarding house Friday morning. Marcus wasn't there. His room had been cleared out, his few possessions gone. The landlord said Marcus had left Thursday night, paid through the week, but said he was moving unexpectedly, some kind of family emergency. The landlord hadn't asked questions, was just relieved to have the room available to rent again. Detectives processed the room and found traces of Laura's blood on clothing Marcus had left behind in a trash bag. They also found Laura's cell phone, wiped clean but carelessly left in a drawer. GPS data from the phone would later help investigators locate Laura's body. Marcus Hale was now a fugitive. His photo went out nationwide. America's Most Wanted featured his case. Tips came in from across the country, possible sightings that mostly led nowhere. Meanwhile, the search for Laura's body continued based on the GPS data and the patterns of Marcus's movements that could be reconstructed from traffic cameras and witness statements. Laura's body was found on Sunday morning by a highway worker who noticed disturbed earth and brush along a service road. The recovery was handled with care, every piece of evidence documented. The medical examiner's report confirmed what everyone feared. Laura had been sexually assaulted and murdered, time of death estimated at late Wednesday night or early Thursday morning. She'd been alive for at least 6 hours after her abduction, subjected to violence and terror before finally being killed. The investigation into Marcus Hale's movements and background revealed a cascade of failures that had allowed him to commit this crime. His federal probation officer had last seen him 10 days before Laura's murder. At that meeting, Marcus had claimed he was working at a warehouse, but when investigators checked, the employer had no record of anyone by that name. Marcus had lied, and the lie hadn't been caught because there was no system in place for real-time verification. Marcus's criminal history was extensive and violent. Beyond the armed robbery that sent him to federal prison, he had prior convictions for assault, domestic violence, and stalking. Psychological evaluations done during his incarceration had flagged him as high risk for reoffending, particularly for violent crimes. Yet his supervision upon release was minimal, the same level as someone convicted of nonviolent drug offenses. The system treated all supervisors essentially the same regardless of their risk level, spreading resources so thin that effective monitoring became impossible. More troubling was the discovery that Marcus had violated his supervised release multiple times in the months before Laura's murder. He'd failed to report address changes, had been fired from jobs without informing his probation officer, and had left his designated district without permission. None of these violations had triggered enforcement action. They were documented in Marcus's file, but not acted upon. The system knew Marcus was non-compliant, but did nothing to bring him back into compliance or revoke his supervised release. Marcus was caught 3 weeks after Laura's murder in a motel in Arizona. He'd been living off the cash withdrawn from Laura's account, supplemented by a few small robberies. His capture was almost anticlimactic. A motel clerk recognized him from news coverage and called police. Officers arrested him without incident. He waived extradition and was transported back to face charges. The trial began 9 months later. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Security footage, DNA evidence, Laura's blood on Marcus's clothing, GPS data, witness testimony. Marcus's defense attorney argued that while Marcus had clearly killed Laura, he'd done so in a moment of panic, that he hadn't planned to murder her. This argument fell flat given the deliberate nature of the crime: the stalking, the abduction, the sexual assault, the disposal of the body. The jury found Marcus guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and robbery. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Marcus was given the opportunity to make a statement. He stood at the defense table and delivered a rambling speech that blamed everyone but himself for his actions. He blamed his childhood, the prison system, society, even his probation officer for not monitoring him more closely. He said Laura's death was tragic but inevitable, that the system had created him and then set him loose to do exactly what they should have known he'd do. It was a chilling performance, devoid of genuine remorse, focused entirely on his own grievances. Laura's sister, Catherine, delivered a victim impact statement that reduced the courtroom to silence. She described Laura's kindness, her dedication to helping others, the hole her death had left in dozens of lives. She described identifying Laura's body, planning a funeral for a murder victim, trying to explain to Laura's elderly clients why their caregiver wouldn't be coming back. And she directed her final words not at Marcus, but at the system that had failed to supervise him. She asked how someone with Marcus's history could be released with minimal oversight, how violations of his supervised release could be documented but not acted upon, how her sister's death could have been prevented if anyone had been paying attention. The aftermath of Laura's murder led to significant reforms in the federal supervised release system. Caseloads for probation officers were reduced, allowing for more frequent and meaningful contact with supervisors. A risk assessment tool was implemented to identify high-risk individuals who required enhanced supervision, including GPS monitoring and more frequent check-ins. Violations of supervised release were flagged for immediate review rather than simply being filed away. And critically, information sharing between law enforcement agencies was improved so that local police were aware when high-risk individuals on federal supervision were living in their jurisdictions. These reforms came too late for Laura Kensington, but they represented a recognition that the system had failed catastrophically. Marcus Hale should never have been able to move freely through a neighborhood, stalking and planning violence, while supposedly being supervised by the federal government. The fact that he could violated the basic premise of supervised release, that dangerous individuals released from prison would be monitored to protect public safety. Catherine Kensington became an advocate for victims' rights and criminal justice reform, speaking at conferences and meeting with legislators. She emphasized that reform didn't mean being soft on crime, but rather being smart about it. She argued that effective supervision protects communities far better than harsh sentences followed by inadequate monitoring. She pushed for funding increases for probation services, for better training for officers, for technology that could help track compliance without requiring impossible caseloads. Laura's case also reignited debates about mandatory minimum sentences and prison reform. Marcus's 8-year sentence for armed robbery had seemed appropriate at the time, but it had done nothing to address the underlying issues that made him dangerous. He'd served his time in an overcrowded prison that focused on warehousing rather than rehabilitation. He'd been released with minimal support or preparation for re-entry. And then he'd been placed on supervision that existed more in theory than in practice. Every step of the process had failed to prevent him from reoffending, and Laura had paid the price for those failures. Now, as we approach the end of this examination of 5 cases spanning 2 decades, patterns become visible. These weren't random tragedies. They were systematic failures, different in detail but similar in structure. Each case involved warning signs that were seen but not acted upon, systems that existed but didn't function, opportunities for intervention that were missed or ignored. Let's pull those patterns apart and see what they tell us about justice, prevention, and the gap between what we promise to do and what we actually accomplish. The first pattern is the gap between surveillance and prevention. Emily Hartwell's abduction was captured on camera, frame by frame, a perfect record of a tragedy in progress. That footage helped catch her killer and became a powerful tool for prosecution. But it didn't save Emily. She was already gone by the time anyone saw that tape. The surveillance camera documented the crime, but didn't prevent it. This is the fundamental limitation of surveillance. It gives us evidence after the fact, but rarely stops violence in the moment. Since Emily's case, surveillance has expanded dramatically. Cameras are everywhere now, in cities and suburbs, in schools and parks, on doorbells and dashboards. We live in the most surveilled society in history. And yet crimes still happen, children still go missing, violence still occurs. Surveillance makes solving crimes easier, makes prosecution stronger, gives us a sense that we're doing something to stay safe. But it doesn't actually make us safer in any preventive sense. We've invested billions in watching ourselves, and what we've gained is documentation, not protection. The second pattern is the failure of parole and supervised release systems. Victor Halden and Marcus Hale both spent years moving through the world while supposedly being monitored by authorities. Both had extensive violent histories. Both had been flagged as high risk. Both violated the terms of their supervision repeatedly. And both were allowed to continue offending because the systems meant to watch them were too underfunded, too overwhelmed, too dysfunctional to actually do the job. This failure isn't about individual probation or parole officers. Most of them are dedicated professionals trying to do an impossible job with inadequate resources. The failure is structural. We've created a system where people with 200 active cases are expected to provide meaningful supervision. We've created a system where violations are documented but rarely enforced because enforcement requires resources we haven't allocated. We've created a system that promises public safety but delivers only paperwork. Reform since Victor's and Marcus's cases has helped. Reduced caseloads, better risk assessment, improved information sharing. These changes prevent some reoffending. But the fundamental tension remains. We want to believe in rehabilitation and second chances, but we're unwilling to fund the monitoring and support that would make safe reentry possible. We release people from prison and then act surprised when inadequate supervision leads to new crimes. The third pattern is our struggle with juvenile justice. Evan Cole's case exposed the impossible questions we face when children commit adult crimes. Is a 14-year-old who kills someone a child who deserves rehabilitation or a murderer who deserves punishment? Our legal system tries to have it both ways, treating most juveniles in a separate system while allowing the worst cases to be transferred to adult court. But this compromise satisfies no one and helps no one. The neuroscience is clear. Adolescent brains are not adult brains. Teenagers literally cannot evaluate consequences, control impulses, or make decisions the way adults do. Charging them as adults ignores biological reality. But teenagers can also cause real harm, can kill, can destroy lives. Hannah Pierce is just as dead whether Evan Cole's brain was fully developed or not. The challenge is creating a system that recognizes both truths, that juveniles are fundamentally different from adults, and that their crimes still require accountability and consequences. Some jurisdictions have moved toward blended sentencing, where juvenile offenders are sentenced in the juvenile system, but with the possibility of transfer to adult prison if they don't respond to treatment. This approach tries to balance rehabilitation with public safety, giving young offenders a chance while maintaining serious consequences if they squander that chance. But it's still imperfect, still forcing impossible choices on judges and juries who have to predict whether a 15-year-old murderer can be rehabilitated. The fourth pattern is the crisis in mental health treatment. Daniel Sloan killed his mother during a psychotic break, experiencing delusions and hallucinations that made him unable to recognize reality. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity, because legally, you can't be held responsible for acts committed when you're that divorced from reality. But the system that treated Daniel after his mother's death should have been available before she died. Early intervention might have prevented the tragedy entirely. Mental health care in America is fragmented, underfunded, and stigmatized. People experiencing first psychotic episodes often don't get treatment until after they've done something that brings them into the criminal justice system. Families don't know how to recognize warning signs, don't know how to access care, often can't afford treatment even when they do find it. We've essentially decided to use jails and prisons as our mental health system, criminalizing illness because we won't fund actual treatment. The cost of this approach is measured in tragedies like Margaret Sloan's death. She noticed Daniel was struggling, scheduled a doctor's appointment, tried to help in the ways she knew how. But she didn't recognize the severity of his illness, didn't know that paranoid schizophrenia was emerging, didn't understand that her son was becoming dangerous. By the time the system intervened, she was dead and Daniel's life was destroyed. Both were victims of an illness that's treatable if caught early, but devastating when ignored. The fifth pattern, running through all these cases, is the gap between the systems we've designed and the systems we've actually built. We have laws about supervision, but we don't fund enough probation officers. We have policies about mental health intervention, but we don't provide accessible care. We have rhetoric about protecting children, But we install cameras instead of providing the community programs and support systems that would actually keep kids safe. This gap exists because, as a society, we prefer the appearance of action over the reality of investment. Installing surveillance cameras is visible and feels like we're doing something about crime. Funding probation services is invisible and feels like helping criminals. Building mental health infrastructure is expensive and benefits people we'd rather not think about. Supporting at-risk youth requires long-term commitment with no guarantee of measurable success. We choose the easy, visible responses and then act shocked when they don't actually solve the underlying problems. Each of the 5 cases we've examined could have been prevented. Emily Hartwell might be alive if we had invested in community programs that help families recognize and report concerning behavior. If Caleb Rourke's pattern of inappropriate interest in children had been centralized and acted upon. Victor Halden's decades of violence might have been stopped if parole supervision had been adequate, if jurisdictions had shared information, if someone had been paying attention to his pattern of violations. Hannah Pierce would likely be alive if Evan Cole had access to better emotional support, if there had been adults both teenagers felt safe talking to about the pregnancy scare. Margaret Sloan might have survived if mental health care had been accessible and affordable, if the warning signs of Daniel's psychosis had been recognized and treated. Laura Kensington would be alive if Marcus Hale's supervised release had included actual supervision, if his violations had triggered enforcement, if the system had functioned as designed. Prevention is possible, but it requires investment, political will, and a recognition that safety comes from addressing root causes rather than just documenting consequences. It requires us to care as much about what happens before crimes as we do about what happens after. It requires funding the unglamorous work of social services, mental health care, education, community support. It requires building systems that actually function rather than just creating policies that look good on paper. The families of victims in these 5 cases have mostly moved on with their lives, carrying wounds that never fully heal, but finding ways to function around them. Some became advocates, channeling grief into action, trying to prevent other families from experiencing the same losses. Others withdrew, rebuilt their lives in private, wanted nothing to do with the public conversations about their tragedies. Both responses are valid. There's no right way to grieve, no correct path through trauma. What these families share, across all 5 cases, is a sense that their loved ones deserved better from the systems meant to protect them. Emily Hartwell deserved a community that recognized warning signs about Caleb Rourke. Lucas Moreno and the Brennan family deserved a parole system that actually supervised Victor Halden. Hannah Pierce deserved schools and support systems that could help teenagers navigate relationship crises without violence. Margaret Sloan deserved accessible mental health care that could have treated Daniel's illness. Laura Kensington deserved supervised release that actually meant supervision. These aren't unreasonable expectations. These are basic functions of government: to protect people, to maintain order, to prevent foreseeable harms. When the systems fail this badly, this consistently, across decades and jurisdictions, it's not a series of unfortunate accidents. It's a choice. We've chosen to underfund prevention while overfunding response. We've chosen to install cameras instead of hiring social workers. We've chosen to build prisons instead of treatment centers. We've chosen documentation over intervention. The consequences of these choices are measured in bodies, in destroyed families, in communities traumatized by preventable violence. Emily Hartwell, Lucas Moreno, Michael and Jennifer Brennan, Hannah Pierce, Margaret Sloan, Laura Kensington. These names represent lives that ended because systems failed, but they also represent uncounted others who weren't famous enough or tragic enough to make national news, whose deaths were filed away as statistics rather than examined as evidence of systemic failure. If we're serious about preventing these tragedies, we need to be honest about what prevention actually requires. It requires significant investment in social services and mental health care. It requires reducing caseloads for probation and parole officers to levels where meaningful supervision is possible. It requires better training for teachers, coaches, and other adults who interact with young people to recognize warning signs of abuse, mental illness, or dangerous behavior. It requires creating information sharing systems that allow jurisdictions to coordinate rather than operate in silos. It requires political courage to fund unglamorous but essential programs. Most of all, it requires a shift in how we think about safety. We want to believe that safety comes from being tough on crime, from harsh sentences and maximum surveillance. But the evidence from these 5 cases suggests otherwise. Caleb Rourke, Victor Halden, and Marcus Hale all faced serious criminal consequences for their actions. Those consequences came too late for their victims. Evan Cole received an adult sentence for his crime. That sentence doesn't bring Hannah Pierce back. Daniel Sloan was institutionalized. That doesn't restore Margaret Sloan to life. Real safety comes from intervention before crimes occur. It comes from identifying people who are dangerous or struggling and providing treatment, supervision, or support. It comes from creating communities where teenagers like Hannah and Evan have access to counseling, where families like Margaret and Daniel can get mental health care, where women like Laura aren't targeted by predators who slip through supervision cracks. These interventions are harder to measure than arrest rates or conviction statistics, but they're ultimately more effective at actually preventing harm. The 5 cases we've examined span different types of violence, different failures, different victims and perpetrators. But they share a common lesson. Warning signs are only useful if we act on them. Systems only protect people if they're adequately funded and functional. Laws only matter if they're enforced. The machinery of prevention, intervention, and justice exists in our society. The question is whether we're willing to make it work. As we conclude this examination, it's worth remembering that these cases aren't ancient history. The systemic failures they revealed are still present, still causing harm, still allowing preventable tragedies. Probation officers still carry impossible caseloads. Mental health care is still fragmented and difficult to access. Schools still lack adequate counseling resources. Information sharing between jurisdictions is better than it was, but still imperfect. We've made progress, but the fundamental problems remain largely unsolved. The families of victims in these cases have fought for reforms, testified before legislatures, shared their grief publicly in hopes of preventing future tragedies. They've created scholarships in their loved ones' names, established foundations, pushed for policy changes. Their advocacy has made a difference, has saved lives we'll never know about, because prevented tragedies don't make headlines. But they've also had to live with the knowledge that their own loved ones' deaths were preventable, that the reforms that came after came too late for them. This is the cruelest aspect of systemic failure. Each tragedy teaches lessons that could prevent the next one, but those lessons are always purchased with lives that didn't need to be lost. We learn from Emily Hartwell's death how to better coordinate information about suspicious behavior around children. We learn from Victor Halden's decades of violence how to improve parole supervision. We learn from Hannah Pierce's death about the need for better support systems for teenagers. We learn from Margaret Sloan's death about the importance of accessible mental health care. We learn from Laura Kensington's death about the necessity of functional supervision for released offenders. But Emily, Lucas, the Brennans, Hannah, Margaret, and Laura can't benefit from these lessons. They paid the price for our societal choices, for our failure to invest adequately in prevention, for our preference for visible response over invisible intervention. Their families carry that knowledge, that their loved ones died teaching lessons we should have learned already, that could have been learned from previous tragedies if we'd been paying attention. The question that opened this documentary remains: what happens when warning signs are seen but not acted on? We've spent several hours examining the answer. People die. Families are destroyed. Communities are traumatized. And the cycles of violence continue because we've documented problems without actually solving them. But there's another question equally important. Now that we've seen these patterns, now that we understand these failures, will we act differently going forward? Will we fund the programs and systems that would actually prevent violence rather than just responding to it? Will we choose investment in mental health care, supervision, social services, and community support? Or will we continue to prefer the appearance of action over the reality of prevention? The 5 cases examined in this documentary span from 2003 to 2016, but their lessons remain urgently relevant. The systemic failures that allowed these tragedies continue to exist, continue to put people at risk, continue to prioritize response over prevention. We can choose differently. We can build systems that actually function. We can invest in the unglamorous work of keeping people safe rather than just documenting when we fail to do so. That choice requires political will, sustained commitment, and a recognition that prevention is harder and less visible than prosecution, but ultimately more effective. It requires funding adequate supervision for people on parole, ensuring probation officers have manageable caseloads and the resources to actually monitor compliance. It requires creating accessible mental health care, so families like the Sloans can get help before tragedy strikes rather than after. It requires building support systems in schools and communities so teenagers like Hannah and Evan have adults to turn to in crisis. It requires information sharing and coordination so predators like Victor Halden can't slip between jurisdictional cracks. These investments won't prevent every tragedy. Some violence is truly unpredictable. Some crimes happen despite all reasonable precautions. But the 5 cases we've examined weren't unpredictable. They were foreseeable, preventable, and ultimately tragic because we failed to invest in prevention adequately. Each case involved warning signs that were documented but not acted upon, systems that existed in theory but not in functional reality, opportunities for intervention that were missed because resources weren't available. The reforms that followed these cases have made differences at the margins. Improved supervision has prevented some repeat offenses. Better information sharing has helped catch some predators before they claim multiple victims. Enhanced mental health awareness has led some families to seek help earlier. These are real improvements, and they've saved real lives. But they're incremental changes to systems that need fundamental transformation. We need to move beyond reactive reform, where each tragedy leads to narrow policy changes aimed at preventing that exact scenario from recurring, to proactive investment in comprehensive prevention infrastructure. We need to fund mental health care not just for people who've already committed violent acts, but for everyone who needs it. We need to staff probation and parole offices at levels that allow meaningful supervision, not just paperwork processing. We need to create community support systems that identify at-risk individuals and provide intervention before crisis points are reached. This transformation requires resources, but the cost of not making these investments is measured in lives lost and families destroyed. Emily Hartwell's parents spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the search for their daughter and the subsequent advocacy work. Victor Halden's victims included children whose families paid enormous costs in grief and trauma. Hannah Pierce's death cost a community its sense of safety and coherence. Margaret Sloan's death cost the loss of a dedicated teacher and left her son institutionalized. Laura Kensington's death cost dozens of elderly and special needs clients who depended on her care. The economic costs alone of these failures are staggering, before we even consider the incalculable human costs. Prevention is cheaper than response, more humane than punishment, more effective than documentation. But it requires patience and faith, willingness to invest in systems whose success is measured by the absence of headlines rather than the presence of arrests. It requires recognizing that the best outcome is a tragedy that never happens, a victim who never becomes a victim, a perpetrator who never offends because intervention came early enough to change the trajectory. The families of victims in these 5 cases deserve to be remembered not just as cautionary tales, but as people who loved and were loved, who had plans and dreams and futures that were stolen by preventable violence. Emily Hartwell wanted to study marine biology, loved dolphins, organized books with careful precision. Lucas Moreno was a child in foster care, hoping for stability and belonging. Michael and Jennifer Brennan were raising 2 children in a remote cabin they'd chosen for its peace and beauty. Sarah and Christopher survived, but carry trauma that will shape their entire lives. Hannah Pierce was seeking love and acceptance after a difficult childhood, trying to build connections in a world that had often failed her. Margaret Sloan was a teacher who bought school supplies with her own money and stayed late to help struggling students. Laura Kensington was a caregiver who made elderly and disabled people's lives easier through quiet, consistent support. These were real people, not abstractions, not data points in discussions about criminal justice reform. Their deaths matter not just as evidence of systemic failure, but as losses that can never be recovered, futures that can never be realized, potential that was destroyed. When we talk about prevention, we're talking about giving other potential victims the chance to live full lives, to achieve their dreams, to love and be loved, to simply exist without becoming tragedies. The perpetrators in these cases also represent lost potential, though of a different sort. Caleb Rourke might have been identified and treated before his obsession with children turned violent if systems had existed to track patterns of concerning behavior. Victor Halden showed signs of dangerous psychology from childhood, signs that were documented but never led to effective intervention. Evan Cole was a frightened teenager who made an irreversible decision in a moment of panic, a decision that's shaped by adolescent brain development he couldn't control. Daniel Sloan was failed by a mental health system that didn't catch his psychosis until after he'd killed his mother. Marcus Hale was released into a supervision system so dysfunctional it was effectively meaningless. This isn't to excuse their actions or diminish their responsibility. Each of them made choices that destroyed lives and deserve to face consequences for those choices. But it's to recognize that in a different world, with different systems, some of these crimes might never have occurred. If Caleb Rourke had been flagged and monitored after his earlier inappropriate behavior, if Victor Halden had received adequate supervision and treatment instead of repeatedly being released to offend again, if Evan Cole had access to better support systems and counseling, if Daniel Sloan had gotten mental health care before his psychosis led to violence, if Marcus Hale had been actually supervised instead of nominally supervised, the systems we build shape the outcomes we get. We've built systems that are good at documenting crimes, prosecuting offenders, and warehousing people in prisons. We've invested heavily in these reactive responses, but we've underinvested in the proactive work of identifying risks, providing treatment, ensuring adequate supervision, creating support systems that catch people before they fall. The result is predictable. We solve crimes efficiently, but prevent them poorly. Changing this pattern requires political courage because prevention is difficult to campaign on. There are no dramatic arrest photos, no powerful prosecution speeches, no clear before and after comparisons. Prevention is quiet work, unglamorous work, work whose success is invisible. But it's the work that actually keeps communities safe, that protects potential victims, that saves lives rather than just avenging them. The 5 cases examined in this documentary should haunt us, not because they're unusual, but because they're representative. For every case that makes national news, dozens of smaller tragedies occur that never get attention beyond local coverage. For every Emily Hartwell whose surveillance footage becomes iconic, there are children who disappear without cameras capturing their final moments. For every Victor Halden whose decades of crimes finally get connected, there are predators whose victims remain in separate files and separate jurisdictions. For every Daniel Sloan whose psychotic break ends in tragedy, there are families struggling with mental illness without access to adequate care. These cases are windows into systemic failures that affect communities nationwide. The specific names and locations change, but the patterns repeat. Inadequate supervision, fragmented information systems, underfunded mental health care, support systems that exist in theory but not in practice. We've spent decades documenting these failures, studying them, producing reports and recommendations. What we haven't done is invest adequately in actually fixing them. The time for studies and reports has long passed. We know what works. We know adequate supervision reduces recidivism. We know early mental health intervention prevents crisis. We know community support systems help at-risk youth. We know information sharing between jurisdictions catches predators faster. We don't need more research. We need more resources, more political will, more commitment to actually building the systems we've designed on paper, but never fully funded. As this documentary concludes, we want to emphasize that while these stories are difficult to hear, they're important to understand. The victims deserve to be remembered and honored. Their families deserve to know that their loved ones' deaths led to reforms, however incomplete. And we as a society deserve to understand that these tragedies reflect choices we've made collectively about where to invest resources and attention. We've chosen to invest in response over prevention, documentation over intervention, punishment over treatment. Those choices have consequences measured in lives lost. But choices can change. We can decide to fund probation services adequately. We can decide to make mental health care accessible and affordable. We can decide to build real support systems in schools and communities. We can decide to create information sharing systems that actually function. We can decide to invest in prevention with the same commitment we've brought to prosecution. Thank you for staying with us through these difficult stories. If you found this documentary valuable, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more true crime content. Leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what reforms you think would make the most difference in preventing tragedies like these. Your engagement helps us continue producing content that goes beyond sensationalism to examine the systemic issues underlying crime and violence. Remember Emily Hartwell, Lucas Moreno, Michael and Jennifer Brennan, Sarah and Christopher Brennan who survived, Hannah Pierce, Margaret Sloan, and Laura Kensington. Remember them not just as victims, but as people who deserved better from the systems meant to protect them. Remember that their deaths were preventable, that the warning signs were visible, that the failures were systemic, not individual. And remember that we have the power to choose differently going forward, to build systems that actually prevent violence rather than just documenting it after the fact. The question that opened this documentary was, what happens when warning signs are seen but not acted on? We've seen the answer in 5 heartbreaking cases. The final question is, now that we've seen the warning signs in our systems themselves, will we act on them? Will we invest in prevention? Will we build functional supervision, accessible mental health care, comprehensive support systems? Or will we continue to prefer the appearance of action over the reality of protection? The answer to that question will determine how many future families are spared the grief experienced by the Hartwells, the Brennans, the Pierces, the Sloans, and the Kensingtons. It will determine whether the lessons purchased with these lives actually lead to change or just become more documentation in files that no one acts upon. The choice is ours. The warning signs are clear. The question is whether we'll act on them.